right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Tommy Butts. I am a assistant professor and extension weed scientist here at Purdue University. I'm pleased today to be able to be with a part of the Crop Protection Network webinar series for 2025. And today I get to talk about the ins and outs of drone herbicide applications. So again, just thanks for joining me for this, and let's just kick it off. So first and foremost, the thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that spray drones are basically exponentially increasing in the United States. So they are very quickly becoming a popular option out there. This was a map put together by one of the graduate students here at Purdue, looking at the number of registered spray drones across the country. I think right now we're sitting somewhere at about 3,000 to 3,500 spray drones registered across the U.S. And it's steadily increasing. In the second half of 2024, it increased by around 1,500 or so, 1,000 to 1,500 drones. So it almost doubled in registered drones just in a 6-month time period there. So again, exponentially increasing in the number of registered spray drones available across the U.S. There's a handful of various platforms out there that are commercially available right now. DJI just dominates the market, though. So the DJI Agris T40 has been the major player out there that is most widely used right now. The T30 still has some market share as well. The T50 is gaining market shares. It's the next new one coming out. There's also a couple other companies, though. XAG has their P100 Pro and soon to be the P150 that has a fair amount of market share. And then Helio is probably the third major company in here. So these three dominate most of the market in the U.S. With their different spray drones. Now, I just did want to mention, again, there are various platforms out there, various spray drones, and it's kind of important to know, if you're trying to get into the business of using a spray drone, or if you're trying to hire a custom applicator with a spray drone, it's kind of important to know that there are differences amongst all these. And we're going to get into some of these details later. But I just wanted to mention, here's 4 various popular spray drones out there right now: the XAG P100 Pro, the DJI Agris T40, the Agris T30, and the Helio Ag 272. And these all can vary depending on rotor diameter and length, the number of rotors. The payload capacity changes with all of these, which then also means the takeoff weight and the downwash that comes out of these things can be different. Application speeds and heights, all of that can be variable depending on these different platforms that you might be using. Now, also one of the other unique things with these various spray drone platforms is what nozzles they're actually using to apply the chemicals with. So the DJI Agris T30 that we mentioned and the Helio 272 actually uses standard hydraulic nozzles that we're used to with ground applications. So you can just plug and play those nozzles. It's typical droplet sizes that you would expect out of those catalogs, roughly speaking. So they can range from, very fine to ultra coarse, just massive, large droplet sizes. With a lot of the newer platforms, so the XAG and the DJI, the XAGs and the Agris T40 or T50, they have what are called rotary atomizers, or these spinning disc nozzles. And so that really changes, again, some of the dynamics for spraying. And in effect, what happens is the spray comes down and these discs are spinning at a high RPM, and the liquid just kind of shoots out of these little curves and forms droplets at the end of those curves and is emitted. The plus side to these is that they can be, without having to change the nozzle, you can select different droplet size classes by either changing discs or changing the speed at which they're rotating. And they normally produce a fairly consistent droplet size, like a kind of a constant droplet size. However, I don't think you can't quite get as large and reduce the drift potential as much as you could with plugging on hydraulic nozzles. And if you're really trying to pinpoint a specific droplet size for specific applications, they're not as finite, useful changes as you can with some conventional nozzles. So a little bit of a trade-off there, but I think both can be effective in our spray drone applications out there. Now, real briefly, and I don't want to talk about regulations a lot because I'm not a regulatory guy and I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds, no pun intended, on this, but very quick overview because it is important to know that these are, pretty heavily regulated And, again, whether you're getting in the business to know that you need to go through these regulatory steps, or if you're hiring a custom applicator, these are questions that you want to ask them to make sure that they are legal when they're applying pesticides to your acres. So, first and foremost, a Part 107 or remote pilot certification is kind of needed. You have to pass an exam to be able to do that. That's to fly drones commercially. You also need to register the drone with the FAA. You also have to have a Part 137, which is for agricultural aircraft operations. So this is really what manned aircraft have to go through as well. With spray drones, you have to apply for a bunch of exemptions, but you're still flying under the same FAA part as a manned aircraft is. So you do have to go through that regulatory process. And then you also have to get state agency pesticide applicator licenses, which can vary from state to state. So you have to check in with your state and see what licenses are needed. For example, here in Indiana, to apply pesticides to row crops through a spray drone, you need to have 3 different certifications here in the state. You have to have your core pesticide applicator exam taken. You have to take your agronomic crops pesticide applicator license. And then you also have to take the aerial application pesticide applicator test. So you end up having to take 3 tests, and you have 3 licenses to be able to apply for spray drones in the state of Indiana. So just be aware there is a lot of paperwork and regulations and documentation you need. And I know a lot of folks out there, if they're getting into the business, they actually will hire a lawyer to help them navigate some of these various regulatory things, particularly with navigating the Part 137 and exemptions and everything else. So just be aware of that if you're getting into the business, or again, make sure to ask these questions if you're looking at hiring a spray drone operator. Now, from there, getting out of that, I did want to get into some of the research we've done and looking at how we can maximize the use of these various spray drones. And so the first kind of part that I want to talk about is looking at coverage, swath, and some weed control data that we've had over the past couple years with working with spray drones. So first and foremost, why is it important to know what coverage we're getting and what swath width we have and what the ending weed control looks like? Well, I'm a big football guy, so I always like to rope football references in wherever I can. And so this is the best representation I can possibly have for explaining why this is important. And so I'll play this, and you can see if we have our pests, whatever we're trying to target, if it's weeds here, and we do a whole lot of things wrong. We select the wrong nozzle and droplet size. We have improper swath and overlap. We end up getting poor coverage, or we have other application setup errors. All of those things going wrong, they don't get that pest tackled to the ground and removed. And instead, those pests make it to the end zone. They're causing yield loss. They're causing, in weeds case, they're reproducing and having more seeds to deal with year in and year out. And so it's just a challenging thing. We can't throw all of these things that are wrong at those pests and expect that we're going to get them on the ground and be successful long term. So we really got to make sure we're doing all of these little things right. And just as an example of that, here's an image that was taken here in Indiana from Adam Shanks with Purdue Extension, looking at some of the issues that we've started to hear pop up with spray drones. And so if you look at both of these applications, you can see these yellow streaks throughout the field. And what that is where the spray drone, we didn't have proper overlap with the spray drone, and we ended up streaking the field some. This was with a fungicide application, but we ended up streaking the field some, and those yellow areas are areas where there was more plant disease because the fungicide didn't quite get the full coverage that the operator thought it was supposed to. So we're seeing some of this streaking happen in a field. With weeds, it's really important because we're either going to leave strips of weeds left or slowly select for resistance because we're going to have reduced rates hitting some of those outside targets. So it's important to figure some of these things out in advance before we're applying to our fields. Now, just to jump right into some of the results, we've done some research both when I was at the University of Arkansas and then also now here at Purdue University, looking at spray coverage with a spray drone and various nozzles and various GPA. And so this was done with a DJI Agris T30, and we flew at 2 and 5 GPA and had 3 different nozzles. So an XR flat fan, a TADF from Greenleaf, and a ULD from Hypro, and the XR is from TJet. And basically, we compared all of that to a Mudmaster or a ground rig application that was at 10 GPA. So kind of some commercial standards, basically. And you can see all the other application stuff down here in the right corner. But we wanted to look at spray coverage directly underneath the spray drone and see what that looked like from these various treatment factors. And so the first and foremost thing that I always like to point out with this is when we look at the drone at 2 GPA, this made me nervous when I first looked at this to see coverage directly underneath the drone never reach greater than 5%. Right now, that's not weed control, so we'll talk about weed control in a second. But when I see coverage less than 5%, that makes me a little nervous. Now, if we do increase our spray volume a little bit, so we get to 5 GPA, these start looking like good coverages from a spray drone. And actually, if we compare it to our ground rig at 10 GPA, so double the spray volume, with these couple of nozzles that were larger droplet sizes, you'll see we didn't have any statistical difference in coverage between 5 GPA and 10 GPA. The spray drone was getting us just as good a coverage as the ground rig was. Now, with a fine spray, you'll see we got more coverage with the 10 GPA. But again, 10%, we're above 10%. That's still a pretty decent coverage to hopefully help us with weed control. So there is some promising signs when we just strictly look at coverage underneath that spray drone. Now, when we get out of that, we really want to see where the rubber meets the road, though. We want to know what weed control looks like. So we did a study with a burn down application looking at paraquat in the spring, excuse me, at multiple sites to try and manage our winter annual weeds from a burn down perspective. Now, I'll be honest, when I first set this up, my goal was almost to make the spray drone applications fail, right? I want to stress test them as much as possible and see whether they're going to be successful or not. And so it was a low label rate of paraquat. We had some tall weeds out there. I mean, almost some knee-high ryegrass. And so we were stressing the system as much as possible to see how these spray drones would react at low volumes. And just to show some pictures, and then we'll get into the actual data, the yellow boxes were the 2 GPA treatments, and nozzle was not significant, so I'm just averaging these across the 3 different nozzle types. But that was a 2 GPA treatment, and you can see, it honestly looks quite good. There's a little bit green, a little bit greener, but it's not bad at all. If we look at the blue boxes, that's 5 GPA, and you can see that does look just slightly better than the 2 GPA treatments, but honestly, there's, quite a bit dead. And then the black boxes are the 10 GPA treatments from the ground rig. And again, looks very similar to those blue boxes. You can't tell much of a difference in the greenness just looking visually at it between those couple treatments. And when we stick some numbers to it, you'll notice that visually, the visual ratings, the 5 and 10 GPA, so again, 5 out of a drone and 10 out of a ground rig, were statistically similar across the board, whether we were talking about visual ratings, biomass, or vary is a greenness index from remote sensing. So it's basically how green was the plot. And you can see there was no difference between a drone at 5 and the ground rig at 10, statistically similar across the board for our weed control. With 2 GPA out of the drone, we saw a little bit of a lag in the visual ratings, both at 1 week and 4 weeks after application. But if we looked at the weed biomass and we look at that greenness index, at 7 days after application or 1 week after application, there was a slight lag in the greenness, but by 4 weeks after, it was statistically similar to the other 2 treatments again. So to summarize all that, right, basically what that says is the spray drone is showing a very positive opportunity for weed control, even with reduced spray volumes and across different nozzle types. Now, I'm not saying that I really like that 2 GPA across the board, even though it ended up being statistically similar. It was a little bit slower to react. You have less room for error, right? If something else goes wrong, if the environmental conditions aren't right, or we have, something else against us, you're going to have less room for error at that real low spray volume of 2 GPA. And so it makes me a little bit more nervous. But I like to say that if everything goes right, it does seem like it can work. So there's some real positives here on that end of spray drones. Now, I say all that to say I like to start with the positives, and I'm a weed scientist, though, so I always got to bring in some negatives, too. All right, I got to bring it back to the negative side of things. So the negative side that we've seen with spray drones is the consistency with swath width and the consistency of that deposition and where it's landing. And and the accuracy, I should say, too. And so this was from, basically we used the same treatments that we just saw on the weed control side, but we did this experiment at Purdue where we were looking at the swath width, the effective swath width of that spray drone, basically the effective width that spray drone was covering to control weeds. Now, we have to input into the system what we want it to think that swath width is, and it does all its calculations in the background for, the pump volume and the output and everything else. It all bases it off of this width and the speed that we tell it to go. So when we did this experiment, we told it that we're expecting a 20-foot swath out of this spray drone. And so if it was setting up overlapping passes, every overlapping pass would be 20 feet apart. Now, what you'll notice when we started doing these various things, none of our effective swath ever reached 20 feet. So our max effective swath was actually only 14 feet. So that means we'd have about 6 feet in between each overlapping pass that is not receiving the actual effective dose that we want it to be receiving. So that's a big issue. The second thing that you'll notice here is that depending on the application setup, so whether we go from 2 to 5 GPA or whether we increase our droplet size by changing nozzles, so we go from an XR to a TADF, which the XR was a fine spray, the TADF was a coarse spray, I believe. We could go anywhere from 14 feet for an effective swath all the way down to 7 feet for an effective swath, and we're supposed to be at 20. So there is a massive potential here for streaking, like I showed in that previous picture with fungicides. And that's, again, negative from multiple standpoints, whether it's we're leaving weeds in the field or we're giving weeds, a lower than effective dose and just selecting for herbicide resistance evolution. So this is what becomes really critical is if you have your own spray drone or you're hiring a custom crew to come in, the main question is have you pattern tested? What does your effective swath width look like? Have you figured all of that out to make sure that you're not streaking fields as you're applying with these different things? Excuse me. And so then we wanted to look at basically where was this spray depositing, right? And so if you look at this, it almost looks like a lot of our applications started to funnel that spray more into the center. If we either went to a higher spray volume or we got a larger droplet size that wasn't maybe moving off target as much, it appeared that rotor wash was maybe funneling our spray into the dead center of the application. And effectively, that's what we saw then when we looked at an estimated recovery rate. And so this was basically, we took the coverage cards and we had deposition estimates from it. And we related that back to what the theoretical deposition should be based on our 2 and 5 and 10 GPA, right? And so what you'll notice here, the black bars are the drone at 2 GPA, the tan bars are the 5 GPA drone, and the gray bars are the ground rig at 10 GPAs. If we look at our standard ground rig application, we generally, depending on the nozzle type here, it varied quite a bit, but generally somewhere between 50% and 80% is where we landed on the estimated recovery rate on those spray coverage cards, dead center underneath the application. So 50 to 80%. Instead, when we look at our spray drones, dead center underneath that spray drone, at 5 GPA, when we were going a little bit slower, because that's how we got to 5 GPA was we had a slower speed, we were funneling a ton of that spray into that dead center, and we were actually achieving over 90% recovery rate with that chemical out of all of these nozzles except for the XR, which is a fine spray and probably had a little bit more movement off target. So a lot of these are getting funneled right into the middle, and we're having a higher recovery rate there in the middle versus what our actual application rate is, but then we're losing it on the outsides, and that's why we're seeing this kind of skipping potential or the streaking potential. If you look at the black bars, even the 2 GPA treatment with a few of these nozzles, we reached 90% or greater or more, and even all of those generally had more than 60% being deposited in the center. So again, these drones, no matter if they're traveling fast or slower, because of that rotor wash, it likes to force a lot of the spray into the center versus those outsides. And so it's really critical to make sure we're getting these swath widths correct, because we could be potentially overdosing in the center, which may be really good for weed control, but it also may end up with more crop injury concerns. And we're probably seeing some lack of coverage on the outside, which again could be loss in weed control or even selecting for herbicide resistance. So just be aware these dynamics on spray drones are drastically different than our ground rig applications, and they like to funnel some of this spray right into the center of the application. And this has been shown in some other research that we've done. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically for couple different nozzles here, we're looking at the droplet size and where the spray pattern was kind of forming. And so with the XR nozzle, the top graph is when there was no rotor turned on and where we could sample droplets from. The bottom graph here is where we turned on the rotor and measured droplet size. And you can see it funnels in these droplets once you have a rotor turned on and you have some of that downwash, right? And you see it the same if you change to a different nozzle. When we had a larger droplet size, we had a smaller overall measurement zone that we could measure droplets in than when we had a finer spray. But once we turn that rotor on, the same effect happened. It cuts that down even further where you can sample those droplets. And so again, we're funneling spray into the middle and we're cutting down on that potential swath width. Now, I wanted to tie this back with the weed control ratings a little bit, where we saw, basically comparable weed control from our drone applications versus the ground rig applications. And again, we've seen really good potential out of the drone. So I'm not saying that it's completely fabricated there, but I think some of our, immense positive weed control that we're seeing is due to our sampling methods or our rating methods when we're actually rating weed control, because we generally rate, individual weeds or plots in the very dead center of our plots. And so when we do that, like I just said, these drones are funneling extra spray into the middle, and we're funneling a little bit extra recovery rate. We're seeing a higher dose there. It makes sense that we're getting either higher levels of weed control or equivalent levels of weed control with lower volumes because of these dynamics. So again, still a lot of potential there. But when we see just blanket weed control assessments without kind of understanding that swath and maybe factoring in the entire swath weed control, we're kind of biasing this a little bit. And so I think there's some more issues with this streaking potential that we really need to watch out for commercially than what we've initially been showing in some of our small plot research. And so we have some more work to do on a research front moving forward. But again, there at least is some positives moving forward that this can be effective. We just got to figure out some of the nooks and crannies of this to make it a little bit more consistent and positive. Now, I briefly did want to mention adjuvants as well. So adjuvants can also affect our spray swath and weed control. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this was spray deposition collected from a graduate student here at Purdue University. And you can see basically everything that you plugged into that spray solution, like we talked about with nozzle and spray volume. Adjuvants will also affect what our deposition looks like, and it'll affect our swath width in a second, you'll see here. But so if we have water by itself versus glufosinate or Liberty, you can see what those depositions were. If we started factoring in different adjuvants, each adjuvant changed what kind of deposition what it looked like, right? So NIS increased our deposition a bit from glufosinate by itself. An oil-based adjuvant actually cost us some deposition. If we added a drift reduction adjuvant, it increased us all the way up to over 90%. Again, basically a larger droplet size getting funneled in more to the center. And so we were retaining more and getting a higher deposition rate there. So, and again, this can be good and bad, and we'll show that in a second with swath, but I just want to basically make the point that no matter what you put in the tank or what nozzle you select or anything else that you're doing with these spray drones, it's going to affect your deposition and your swath. And so you really need to test your setups in advance and know what that looks like and be somewhat consistent as you're doing applications throughout the year to maintain an effective swath and consistency across the board. So again, the effective swath, when we look across those different adjuvant programs, we're supposed to be at 20 feet. Again, we never reached that 20 feet marker, and so that we're potentially streaking fields. And again, every adjuvant that we threw in the tank changed what that effective swath looked like a little bit by, upwards of 2 to 3 feet or so. Again, if you add that up across the field, there's some big potential for streaking events that can occur. Weed control, though, like we mentioned, again, it continues to look really positive. And so this was with glufosinate and the different adjuvants. We still saw a positive weed control effect. Now, 57% by Liberty itself is not great, but our weeds were a little bit larger in size than normal. I want to say they were about 10 inches tall. And we had some weather conditions not conducive to great things. So a little overall less, and this averaged across several different weed species as well, which not all of them were effectively controlled by Liberty itself. So there's a few factors in here with these overall levels. But the main thing to note is that we were getting still positive weed control, even at only 2 GPA. And that our adjuvants, whatever we added in there, actually improved our control. Well, I should say the NIS actually improved our control compared to Liberty, and everything else wasn't statistically increased, but numerically it increased it as well. So it does look like there is some real positives to adding in adjuvants to these low spray volume applications for increasing control. And so what I really say is I would find an adjuvant package that seems to work with you really well. And use some that are probably tested through the CPDA program that have been tested for drones and are labeled for drones. And those will probably get you a lot closer to having a successful application and mitigating some other issues than just picking a random adjuvant off the shelf every single time. All right, some other considerations I wanted to throw out there, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but wind direction is going to have an effect on where your droplets are landing as well. So this is actually from some manned aircraft data, but it still relatively applies to unmanned aircraft. It's just maybe not to the same extent because you do have a little bit of downwash from the drones. But generally speaking, if you're flying in wind, your spray pattern is going to kind of get funneled inside a little bit, so you'll have a little bit of an effective swath, but it relatively all lands dead center, and your droplet sizes are kind of just all centered dead center, so you're not getting all your droplet sizes spreading to one side or something, which I'll show you in a second. They basically are kind of random within this pattern, getting floated straight down. Whereas opposite, if you fly in a crosswind environment, now the wind is blowing perpendicular to your flight path. You don't have this nice bell curve anymore. You get this sloped pattern out here. So that changes your effective swath now. It also makes it more difficult for your overlapping coverage passes because all of your fine droplets get forced downwind. All of your larger droplets are on this upwind side. And we always say we get better coverage with these smaller droplets. And so now there's potential depending on what your overlap is. And it's difficult to select your overlap in this instance because you have this strange belt, sliding scale here on this curve, right? And so there's potential that you may end up with greater coverage on each downslope side because of all the fine droplets getting pushed down to that side. So just be aware that whatever your wind direction is at is also going to affect your swath width and your overlapping coverage and again, injury potential versus streaking potential. And then droplet size can play a big role in that. We see that issue a lot more if we're running fine sprays. If we can use a larger droplet size, like a coarse spray, we can mitigate some of that crosswind effect quite a bit more. And so generally speaking, it helps if we can use at least a little bit larger droplet size to help mitigate some of those crosswind effects in certain areas. And then one other piece of operator advice that I did want to mention is make sure that if you're flying or your commercial applicator, if you hire an applicator to fly, make sure they're reading the herbicide label. It's really important to understand and follow that label closely. It gives you a lot of good info to apply it correctly. But like I just stated there, you need to read it correctly and apply it correctly, not like my little man Brooker here who's reading upside down, right? Let's not read the labels upside down. That's not going to be useful. Make sure we read it closely, read it right, and follow those, and that'll help us out a lot too for successfully applying some of these products. And along those lines, I did want to plug the University of Missouri has an extension blog post basically out there that is called Drones and Herbicides, Are We There Yet? And it's a great little article that kind of covers some herbicides and spray drones. But the major thing I really like about it is it has a couple tables that go through the most common corn and soybean herbicides out there and indicates whether they have an aerial application label and what the minimum spray volume is on those labels so that they could be used in spray drone applications. And so you can see an example of that table here. There's the website link down here, or you can follow this QR code and get to that to be able to see some of that information. And again, better follow the labels to accurately apply these products. All right, now I'm sure everybody's confused and looking like this, so I apologize for that. It's a lot of information overload, but just bear with me. There's a lot going on, and so to just kind of wrap it up and give you those concluding statements, spray drone swaths are highly variable. Just about anything may influence that effective swath. So you really need to do your own testing and understand what's going on with your applications and whatever nozzle you're plugging on or whatever adjuvant you're adding into the tank. That's all important to understand. So you need to do some upfront testing. And just realize that a failed application is a wasted application. And so again, it's really good to pattern test in advance and understand these complex processes. And I like to say, find a setup that works for you. Once you've done some of these testings, if you have a flight height, a nozzle, and an adjuvant package that just seem to really work for you, stick to it for the most part, unless you have a very different application practice like a fungicide versus a herbicide or something. Maybe you'll have two different application setups for those, but find a setup that works and kind of stick to it so you can be consistent out there. And as always, spray drones are a developing technology. We have basically 100 years worth of data on ground applications, and we've gradually improved those, over 100 years. Whereas spray drones we've had, for 5 to 10 years at the most. And so we're on the very front end of this technology trying to figure out how to maximize its effectiveness. So we still need a lot of research into these things. Newer models with higher payloads will change some of this, software updates, terrain following. There's going to be a lot of changes over the next few years, but we're building there slowly to make sure that we understand and can maximize these applications. All right, real briefly, I wanted to also mention that with spray drones, targeted applications may be a really good opportunity. So not only can this maybe help our battery life and our carrying capacity with spray drones because we don't have to cover entire fields, this may also be good for some of the regulatory environment by reducing how much chemical we're spraying across the field. And maybe we end up with some herbicide savings and input cost savings as well. So there's a handful of technologies out there already available where we can start to more specifically target weeds and apply chemicals with drones only where we need it rather than broadcasting across an entire field. Now, the one thing to take note of with that is we've been talking about our swath width, and normally we're cutting our swath width down. And so we have to be careful with these targeted applications that if this green area is our targeted zone, right, where we have weeds in this whole green area, even though our system may think that this is our swath width, if we know we're actually a little bit short on our swath width, so we're getting sublethal doses here versus larger doses here, you may need to consider adding buffers to that targeted map, and that you'd end up spraying on this pass, and this pass so you can effectively cover this full area, right? So just be aware of that, or you cut your swath down. But basically, we need to make sure that when we're doing a targeted application, we're covering the entire area where those weeds are at. We don't end up shortcutting ourselves because our swath width isn't 100% correct. And again, just to highlight that, like the center rows versus the outside rows where we end up streaking a field. And a crosswind may also be an effect on this aspect where we showed that tailed end, right? That if we have a tailed end here, we may lose more on this side, but have more coverage on this side, and trying to figure out that optimum overlap can be difficult. But if we get an application on this side, in the middle, and this side, so it's not as much herbicide savings, but we're getting the area covered, that's going to be an optimal way for targeted management. Now, one technology I wanted to mention that already has this available, there's a program called Pix4D, and there's several others out there, but this was one that I have access to and did a quick demonstration. You just need to upload some imagery that you may have taken beforehand. So I flew a field with an imaging drone and uploaded this into the system. And then it has a magic AI tool, and you can basically select things you want to keep. So the blue circles are ones I wanted to keep, which were weeds, right? So you can see that. The yellow circles were things I wanted to get rid of. So I wanted to get rid of the soybeans and bare ground and create a map that was just weeds. I selected a total of 22 cells here, 10 that I kept and 12 that I got rid of. I did this in about 10 minutes. And I spit out this prescription map right here where it showed me where all the weeds were at. And I can take this map and it gives me an estimate of the amount of area of the field that has weeds. And so that may help me mix for certain targeted applications because I know maybe I have a 50% coverage on the field. The other cool thing with this technology is it allowed me to export this map, whether to either to export it to a spray drone or even just to a shape file. And I have created a targeted map that the spray drone will then go follow and only spray where the prescription map tells it to. So really cool technology. Again, not 100% accurate, so it's not 100% there yet, but man, are we on the cutting edge. And in the next few years, this is going to really advance in a hurry. There's a large opportunity here for us to be able to start doing targeted applications on a consistent basis. So with all of that being said, I'm starting to reach my time limit here. I did just want to thank the Purdue Weed Science team here with all the grad students and fellow professors and everything else. It's been a great team to be a part of, and I have a couple grad students starting this spring, Emmanuel and Maria. And so big thanks to all of them for helping with the various research projects and allow me to be able to talk about some of these things. So that's a big benefit to have. And then the final takeaway, I'll just end it with another football reference. And I had to find at least one good Purdue football reference to use. So let me tell you, that was challenging, but I found one good Purdue football reference to use here to illustrate the final takeaway and how all of this kind of works together. And so if we want to try and manage weeds, you know, the novel technology that we talked about, it always gets the glory, right? And comes in and gets this strip sack and is super important for us to be effective for weed management in the future. But it takes a whole team approach to be successful. So we also need to be starting clean and using full rate residuals out there for weed control. We also have to integrate other strategies, you know, whether it's cover crops or other things. If we don't have that guy to recover the football in the end zone, we don't get the touchdown. We just have a touchback, right? So that's not good either. So we have to integrate a bunch of different strategies to be effective as well. And then I also like to say that we have to do the little things right. And so this linebacker right here that drops into coverage and makes sure that that quarterback can't just dump off a little pass, he's important too, right? So we got to do the little things. We got to integrate other strategies. We have to use full rate residuals. And then this novel technology that we're using can do everything that it needs to do for us and be successful. But it's a whole team approach to really managing weeds effectively to move forward and have long-term successful management in our fields. So with that being said, I really thank you for your attention today. If you have any questions, my contact info is going to pop up here. Please feel free to get a hold of me at any time. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the Crop Protection Network for having me on and be able to do this. So thank you very much.